Chapter 6. That day, Mrs. Blenkinsop received a letter from her son Douglas. Mrs. Blenkinsop was so excited that everybody at Sans-Souci heard about it. The letter had not been censored at all, she explained, because one of Douglas's friends coming on leave had brought it, so Douglas had been able to write quite openly. "And it just shows," declared Mrs. Blenkinsop, "how little we really know of what is going on." After breakfast, she went upstairs to her room and put the letter away. Then she went downstairs again. She had already told everyone that she was going up to London for the day to see her lawyer and do a little shopping. And although she had no wish to do so, Mrs. Blenkinsop had said that she was going to London, and to London she must go. It was not until the next day that Tuppence was able to have a meeting with Tommy. Mrs. Blenkinsop met Mr. Meadows as he was taking a walk on the beach. "Well," said Tuppence, "did you see anyone go into my room?" Tommy nodded his head. "The maids went in to clean the room, of course, and Mrs. Perenna went in, but that was when the maids were there. And Betty ran in once and came out with a woolen dog." "Anyone else?" "One person," said Tommy slowly. "Carl von Dynam, at lunchtime. He came out from the dining room early, came up to his room, then went across the passage and into yours. He was there about a quarter of an hour. That settles it, I think." Tuppence nodded. Yes, it was quite clear now. Carl von Dynam could have had no reason for going into Mrs. Blenkinsop's bedroom and remaining there for a quarter of an hour, except for one. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "So am I," said Tommy. "He's a nice boy." "Well, I think we can agree that Carl von Dynam is working with Sheila and her mother," said Tuppence. "Probably Mrs. Perenna is in charge, and that foreign woman who was talking to Carl yesterday must be involved somehow." "What do we do now?" Tommy asked. "We must search Mrs. Perenna's room, and we must follow her and see where she goes and who she meets. Tommy, let's get Albert down here." Many years ago, Albert, who had worked in a hotel, had helped the young Beresfords. Afterwards, he had gone to work for them as a general servant. 6 years ago, he had married and was now the proud owner of the Duck and Dog, a pub in South London. Tuppence continued quickly. "Albert will be really excited. He can stay at the pub near the station, and he can follow the Perennas for us, or anyone else." "What about Mrs. Albert?" "She has gone to her mother's in Wales with the children because of possible air raids on London. It all fits in perfectly." "Yes, that's a good idea, Tuppence. Albert will be perfect. Now, another thing. I think we ought to watch out for that so-called Polish woman who was talking to Carl. She probably comes here for orders or to take messages. Next time we see her, one of us must follow her and find out more about her." Tommy continued his walk and entered the post office where he phoned Mr. Grant. Then he wrote and sent a letter to Albert and bought himself a newspaper. He was walking back to Sans-Souci when Commander Haydock, passing in his car, shouted, "Hello, Meadows! Want a lift?" Tommy got in gratefully. "So you read that awful newspaper, do you?" demanded Haydock, looking at the red cover of the Inside Weekly News. "It's terrible," Tommy agreed,
but sometimes they do seem to know what's going on behind the scenes. The truth of it is, said Commander Haydock, just missing a large van, when they're right, you remember it, and when they're wrong, you forget it. Do you feel like a game of golf tomorrow? I've got to go to a meeting about this parashot business, getting together a group of local volunteers. Good idea, if you ask me. So, will we have a round of golf about 6?
Thanks very much.
Good, then that's agreed.
The commander stopped abruptly at the gate of Sans-Souci.
How's the fair Sheila? He asked.
Quite well, I think. I haven't seen much of her. Haydock gave his loud laugh.
Not as much as you'd like to, I bet. She's a good-looking girl, but she sees too much of that German fellow. Unpatriotic, I call it.
Mr. Meadows said, Be careful. He's just coming up the hill behind us.
I don't care if he does here. Any decent German's fighting for his country, not running over here to avoid it.
Chapter 7. On the following day, Mrs. Sproat went up to London. Various residents of Sans-Souci had offered to look after Betty, and Tuppence had the morning turn.
Play, said Betty. Play hide-seek.
She was talking more easily every day, and had adopted a most attractive habit of putting her head on one side with a lovely smile and murmuring, "Please," which was her way of saying please. Tuppence had intended to take her for a walk, but it was raining, so the two of them went into Mrs. Sproat's bedroom. Betty led the way to the drawer of the bureau where her toys were kept. "Shall we hide Bunzo?" asked Tuppence. But Betty had changed her mind, and demanded instead,
"Read me story."
Tuppence pulled out a book, only to be interrupted by a cry from Betty.
No, bad."
Tuppence stared at her in surprise, and then down at the book, which was a coloured version of Little Jack Horner. "Was Jack a bad boy?" she asked, "because he pulled out a plum?"
"Bad,"
Betty said, and then, with a huge effort,
"Nasty."
She took the book from Tuppence and put it back, then took out an identical book from the other end of the shelf, saying with a huge smile,
"Clean nights, Jack Horner."
Tuppence realised that any dirty, well-read books had been replaced by new and cleaner ones. Mrs. Sproat was always terrified of germs. Tuppence had brought up her own 2 children in contact with a reasonable amount of dirt. However, she took the clean copy of Jack Horner and read it to the child, followed by another, Goosey Goosey Gander. Then Betty hid the books, and Tuppence took an amazingly long time to find each of them, to Betty's great delight, and so the morning passed quickly. After lunch, Betty had her rest, and it was then that Tuppence looked out into the garden and saw that the rain had stopped. At the bottom of the garden, the bushes parted slightly. In the gap, a face appeared. It was the Polish woman staring up at the windows of Sans-Souci. The woman's face had no expression, and yet there was something frightening about it. Turning abruptly from the window, Tuppence ran downstairs, out of the front door and down the path at the side of the house to where she had seen the woman. There was no one there now. Tuppence went through the bushes and out onto the road and looked up and down the hill. She could see no one. Troubled, she turned and went back into Sans-Souci. Could she have imagined the whole thing? No, the woman had been there. She felt a strange sense that something bad was going to happen. Now that the weather had improved, Miss Minton was taking Betty out for a walk. They were going down to the town to buy a toy duck to sail in Betty's bath. Betty was very excited, and the two set off together, Betty saying happily,
Buy a duck! Buy a duck! For Betty Bath! For Betty Bath!
2 matchsticks left crossed on the marble table in the hall was the code that told Tuppence that Mr. Meadows was spending the afternoon following Mrs. Perenna. Tuppence went to the lounge and sat with Mr. and Mrs. Cayley. Mr. Cayley was unhappy. He had come to Leahampton, he explained, for rest and quiet. And what quiet could there be with a child in the house? All day long she was screaming and running about, jumping up and down. His wife murmured that Betty was really a dear little girl, but the comment only annoyed him more.
No doubt, said Mr. Cayley, but her mother should keep her quiet. There are other people to consider. Invalids, people who need to rest.
Quickly, Tuppence changed the subject. I wish you would tell me your views on life in Germany. You've travelled there several times, and it would be interesting to have your point of view. Mr. Cayley smiled.
Dear lady, in my opinion.
Tuppence, murmuring an occasional, Now that's very interesting, listened with close attention. She was quickly convinced that Mr. Cayley was an admirer of the Nazi system. He clearly thought, though he did not say it openly, how much better it would have been if England and Germany had taken sides against the rest of Europe. Nearly 2 hours later, they were interrupted by the return of Miss Minton, Betty and the duck. Looking up, Tuppence caught a strange expression on Mrs. Cayley's face. It might have been simply a wife's jealousy at her husband paying so much attention to another woman. It might have been concern that Mr. Cayley was speaking too clearly about his political views. It certainly expressed dissatisfaction. Tea came next, and soon after that came the return of Mrs. Sproat from London, exclaiming, I do hope Betty's been good. Mrs. Sproat then sat down, drank several cups of tea, and spoke excitedly about what she had bought in London, the crowd on the train, what a soldier recently returned from France had told the people in her train carriage, and what a girl in a shop had told her of shortages to come. The conversation was, in fact, completely normal. It went on afterwards on the terrace outside, for the sun was now shining. Betty rushed happily about, going into the bushes and returning with a leaf or little stones, which she placed in the lap of one of the grown-ups. She would give an explanation in her own little language, which no one could understand, of what they represented. Fortunately, she required little response in her game, being satisfied with an occasional, How nice, darling, is it really? There had never been an evening more typical of Sans-Souci. There was talk about the war. Can France fight back? What is Russia likely to do? Could Hitler invade England if he tried? Will Paris fall to the Germans? Suddenly, Mrs. Sproat glanced at her watch. Goodness, it's nearly 7. I ought to have put that child to bed ages ago. Betty! Betty! It was some time since Betty had returned to the terrace, though no one had really noticed. Mrs. Sproat called her with growing impatience. Betty! Where can the child be? Mrs. O'Rourke said with her deep laugh,
doing something naughty, I've no doubt about it. It's always the way when there's quiet.
Betty, I want you. There was no answer, and Mrs. Sproat rose impatiently. I suppose I must go and look for her. I wonder where she can be. Miss Minton suggested that she was hiding somewhere, but Betty could not be found, either inside or outside the house. They went round the garden calling, and they looked in all the bedrooms. There was no Betty anywhere. Mrs. Sproat began to get annoyed. It's very naughty of her, very naughty indeed. Do you think she can have gone out on the road? Together she and Tuppence went out to the gate and looked up and down the hill. There was no one in sight except a delivery boy with a bicycle standing talking to a maid at the door of the house across the road. Tuppence and Mrs. Sproat crossed the road, and Mrs. Sproat asked if either of them had seen a little girl. The maid asked, "A little girl in a green dress?" Mrs. Sproat replied eagerly, "That's right. I saw her about half an hour ago, going down the road with a woman." Mrs. Sproat said with amazement, "With a woman? What sort of a woman?" The girl seemed slightly embarrassed. "Well, what I'd call a strange-looking woman. I'm sure she was foreign. She was wearing strange clothes, like a kind of shawl, and no hat. Her face was strange too. I've seen her about once or twice lately, and to tell the truth, I thought she was a bit mad." Mrs. Sproat almost collapsed against Tuppence. "Oh, Betty, my little girl, she's been stolen. What did the woman look like? Was she dark?" Tuppence shook her head energetically. "No, she was fair, very fair, with a wide face and blue eyes set very far apart." She saw Mrs. Sproat staring at her and hurried to explain. "I've noticed her around here. Carl von Dynam was speaking to her one day. It must be the same woman." The servant girl agreed. "That's right, fair-haired she was." "Oh!" cried Mrs. Sproat. "What shall I do?" Tuppence put an arm round her. "Come back to the house, have a little brandy, and then we'll ring up the police. It's all right. We'll get her back." Mrs. Sproat cried out weakly, "She's some dreadful German woman, I expect. She'll kill my Betty." "Nonsense," said Tuppence. "It will be all right. I expect she's just some woman who's not quite right in her head." But she did not believe her own words. She did not believe for one moment that the calm blonde woman was mad. Carl, thought Tuppence. Would Carl know? Had he had anything to do with this? However, a few minutes later, she started to doubt this assumption. Carl von Dynam, like the rest, seemed completely surprised. As soon as the facts were told, Major Bletchley took control. "Now then, dear lady," he said to Mrs. Sproat, "sit down here and just drink a little of this brandy. I'll contact the police station immediately." Mrs. Sproat murmured, "Wait a minute, there might be something." She hurried up the stairs and along the passage to her room. A minute or two later, they heard her footsteps running along the upstairs hall. She rushed down the stairs and took Major Bletchley's hand from the telephone receiver, which he was just about to lift. "No, no, you mustn't! You mustn't!" And crying wildly, she collapsed into a chair. They crowded round her. In a minute or two, she recovered herself. Sitting up, with Mrs. Cayley's arm round her, she held something out for them to see. "I found this on the floor of my room. It had been wrapped round a stone and thrown through the window. Look what it says." Tommy took it from her and unfolded it. It was a note written in big, bold letters. "We have got your child. She is safe. You will be told what to do soon. If you go to the police, your child will be killed. Say nothing." Mrs. Sproat was repeating faintly, "Betty, Betty." Everyone was talking at once.
"The dirty, murdering criminals!" exclaimed Mrs. O'Rourke.
Brutes!
Shouted Sheila Perenna.
"I don't believe a word of it. It's a silly practical joke," declared Mr. Cayley.
"Oh, the dear little girl,"
murmured Miss Minton.
"I do not understand. It is shocking," added Carl von Dynam.
And above everyone else, the loud voice of Major Bletchley.
"We must inform the police at once. They'll soon find out what's going on."
Once more he moved towards the telephone. This time a scream from Mrs. Sproat stopped him. He shouted,
"But my dear madam, we must. This note is only to stop you doing anything so that they can get away."
"They'll kill her."
"Nonsense. They wouldn't dare."
"I won't allow it. I tell you, I'm her mother. It's for me to say."
I know. That's what they're counting on. You're feeling like that. It's very natural. But you must believe me. I'm a soldier and an experienced man of the world. The police are what we need."
"No!" Bletchley's eyes went round, searching for agreement.
"Meadows, you agree with me?"
Slowly Tommy nodded.
"Cayley?"
Mr. Cayley nodded too.
"Look, Mrs. Sproat, both Meadows and Cayley agree."
Mrs. Sproat said with sudden energy,
"Men, all of you, ask the women."
Tommy looked at Tuppence, who said, her voice low and shaken, I agree with Mrs. Sproat." She was thinking of her own children. "Deborah, Derek, if it were them, I'd feel like her. Tommy and the others are right. I've no doubt, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk it," she said to herself. Mrs. O'Rourke was declaring,
"No mother alive could risk it, and that's a fact."
Miss Minton said weakly,
"Such awful things happen. We'd never forgive ourselves if anything happened to dear little Betty."
"You haven't said anything, Mr. von Dynam," noted Tuppence sharply. Carl's blue eyes were very bright. His face had no expression. He said slowly,
"I am a foreigner. I do not know your English police. How good they are! How quick!"
Someone had come into the hall. It was Mrs. Perenna. Her cheeks were red. Evidently, she had been hurrying up the hill.
"What's all this?"
she asked. Her voice was commanding, not the pleasant guest-house owner, but a woman of force. They told her, a confused story told by too many people, but she understood it quickly. She held the note for a minute, then she handed it back. Her words were sharp and authoritative.
"The police? They'll be no good. You can't risk their making mistakes. Go after the child yourselves."
Bletchley said.
"Very well."
Tommy added,
"They can't be far away. When did it happen?"
"Half an hour, the maid said," Tuppence answered.
Haydock, said Bletchley. Haydock's the man to help us. He's got a car. The woman's unusual looking, you say? And a foreigner? She ought to leave a trail that we can follow. Come on, there's no time to lose. You'll come along, Meadows?
Mrs. Sproat got up. I'm coming too.
No, my dear lady, leave it to us.
I'm coming too.
Oh, well.
He gave in. Commander Haydock, who understood the situation immediately, drove the car. Tommy sat beside him, and behind were Bletchley, Mrs. Sproat, and Tuppence. Not only did Mrs. Sproat cling to her, but Tuppence was the only one, with the exception of Carl von Dynam, who knew the mysterious kidnapper by sight. The commander was a good organizer and a quick worker. In minutes he had filled up the car with petrol, handed Bletchley a map of the district and a larger map of Leahampton itself, and was ready to start off. Mrs. Sproat had run upstairs again before they left, presumably to get a coat. But when she got into the car and they had started down the hill, she showed Tuppence something in her handbag. It was a small pistol. She explained quietly. I got it from Major Bletchley's room. I remember he said he had one. Tuppence looked a little uncertain. You don't think that... Mrs. Sproat said, her mouth a thin line. It may be useful. Tuppence sat wondering about the strength of a mother's love for a child, even in an ordinary young woman. She could see Mrs. Sproat, the type of woman who would normally be frightened to death of guns, calmly shooting any person who had harmed her child. They drove first, on the commander's suggestion, to the railway station. A train had left Leahampton about 20 minutes earlier, and it was possible that the woman and Betty and whoever else was involved had travelled on it. At the station they separated. The commander questioned the ticket collector, Tommy asked the ticket office staff, and Bletchley checked with the porters outside. Tuppence and Mrs. Sproat went into the ladies' bathroom just in case the woman had gone in there to change her appearance before taking the train. None of them discovered anything.
The kidnappers probably had a car waiting, Haydock suggested, and they made their escape in that.
Tuppence remarked, We must put ourselves in their places. Where would they have waited in the car? Somewhere as near as Sans-Souci as possible, but where a car wouldn't be noticed. Now let's think. The woman and Betty walk down the hill together. At the bottom is the esplanade. The car might have been waiting there. It was at that moment that a small man stepped up to them and said, Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing what you were asking the porter just now. He directed his remarks to Major Bletchley. I was not listening, of course, just came down to see about a parcel, and so, you see, I happened to overhear, and really it did seem the most wonderful coincidence. Mrs. Sproat sprang forward. She took him by the arm. You've seen her? You've seen my little girl? Oh, really? Your little girl, you say? Now, Mrs. Sproat cried, Tell me! Tuppence interrupted calmly. Please tell us anything you have seen as quickly as you can. We will be most grateful if you would. Oh, well, really, of course, it may be nothing at all, but the description fitted so well. Tuppence felt the woman beside her trembling, but she herself tried to stay calm. She knew the type of man with whom they were dealing, not capable of giving a direct answer, especially if hurried. Please tell us, she repeated. Tuppence frowned at Major Bletchley, who was about to start shouting at him, and asked, "And you saw the little girl we're looking for?" "Yes, I really think it must be. A little girl with a foreign-looking woman, you said? It was really the woman I noticed, because, of course, we are all on the lookout nowadays for fifth columnists, aren't we? So, as I say, I noticed this woman. A nurse, I thought, or a maid. And this woman was most unusual looking, and walking up the road to the hills beside the sea. She was with a little girl, and the little girl seemed tired, and it was 7:30, and, well, most children go to bed then. I looked at the woman very closely, and she hurried up the road, pulling the child after her. Finally, she picked her up and went on up the path out onto the cliff, which I thought strange. There are no houses there at all. Nothing. Not until you get to Whitehaven, about 5 miles away." Commander Haydock was back in the car and had started the engine. The others jumped in. Tuppence called out, "Thank you!" and they drove off, leaving him staring after them with his mouth open. They drove quickly through the town, avoiding accidents more by good luck than by skill. The road ended on bare hillside, where there was only a footpath.
"Better get out and walk here,"
said Bletchley. Haydock suggested,
"Why don't we take the car up? The ground's firm enough."
Mrs. Sproat cried, "Oh, yes, please, please, we must be quick." The car bounced about as it went across the rough ground, but they arrived without any problem on the top of the hill. Here the view was clear.
"No sign of them as far as I can see," observed Haydock.
He was standing up, looking through some binoculars that he had brought with him. Suddenly, he focused on 2 small moving figures.
"Got 'em!"
He fell back into the driver's seat again, and now the chase was a short one. Bounced up in the air, thrown from side to side as the car drove over the uneven ground, the occupants of the car quickly got closer to those 2 small figures. They could see them clearly now. A woman holding a child by the hand. Still nearer, yes, a child in a green dress. Betty! Suddenly, the woman turned and saw the car advancing towards her. With a cry, she picked up the child in her arms and began running towards the edge of the cliff. The car could not follow. The ground was now too uneven and blocked with big stones. It stopped, and Mrs. Sproat was out first, running towards them. The others followed her. When they were within 20 yards of her, the kidnapper turned. She was standing at the very edge of the cliff, and with a cry she held the child closer to herself. Haydock exclaimed, "No! She's going to throw the kid over the cliff!" The woman's face was filled with hate. She spoke, a long, angry sentence that none of them understood. And still she held the child and looked from time to time at the sea below. It seemed clear that she was threatening to throw the child over the cliff. All of them stood there, confused and terrified, unable to move for fear of causing a catastrophe. Haydock's hand was in his pocket. He pulled out a pistol and shouted, "Put that child down, or I fire!" The foreign woman laughed. Haydock whispered, "I can't shoot. I might hit the child." Tommy cried, "The woman's crazy. She'll jump over the edge with the child in another moment." Haydock said again helplessly, "It's too dangerous to shoot." But at that moment, a shot rang out. The woman fell back, the child still in her arms. The men ran forward. Mrs. Sproat stood still, the smoking pistol in her hands, her eyes wide open. She took a few steps forward. Tommy was kneeling by the bodies. He turned them over gently. The woman was dead, shot through the head. Unhurt, little Betty Sproat stood up and ran towards her mother, who was standing completely still. Then, at last, Mrs. Sproat moved. She threw away the pistol and fell to her knees, holding the child to her. "She's safe! She's safe! Oh, Betty, Betty!" And then, in a low whisper, she added, Did I kill her?" Tuppence said firmly, "Don't think about it. Think about Betty. Just think about Betty." Mrs. Sproat held the child close against her, crying uncontrollably. Tuppence went forward to join the men. Haydock said, "I couldn't have managed a shot like that. I don't believe the woman has ever used a pistol before. It must have been pure instinct. A miracle, that's what it is." Tuppence murmured, "It was a near thing," and she looked down at the sea far below and shivered. Chapter 8. The police identified the dead woman as Wanda Polonska, a Polish refugee, and the inquest on her death opened with the formal identification of the body by a Mrs. Calfont, who worked with refugees. Polonska, she said, had come to England with a cousin and his wife, who were her only relatives. She had experienced great horror in Poland, and her family, including several children, had all been killed. Polonska talked to herself constantly and did not seem normal. The coroner asked why the woman's relatives were not present, and at this point an Inspector Brassey said that the couple had been arrested for a crime at a naval dockyard. The whole family was considered suspicious. They had had a large sum of money in their possession, which they could not explain, but there was no evidence against Polonska, except that her opinions were believed to have been anti-British. It was possible that she had been an enemy agent. The verdict was that Wanda Polonska had been killed by Mrs. Sproat, but that Betty's mother should not be blamed. The following day, Mrs. Blenkinsop and Mr. Meadows met. "Goodbye, Wanda Polonska," said Tommy sadly. Tuppence nodded. "Yes, and nothing to tell us who she was working for, and no clues about where the money came from that she and her cousins had." "Do you think Karl von Dynam and Wanda Polonska were working together?" asked Tommy. "Yes," said Tuppence. "Then Karl von Dynam must have arranged the kidnapping. But why kidnap Betty? The Sproats have no money, so it wasn't for ransom, and neither of them are employed by government." "I know, Tommy. It just doesn't make any sense at all. But I've a feeling that Mrs. Sproat could find the reason if only she'd think about it. There must be some piece of information that she discovered without knowing what it was." "Say nothing. Wait for instructions," Tommy quoted from the note found on Mrs. Sproat's bedroom floor. "That means something." "The only thing I can think of is that Mrs. Sproat or her husband has been given something to keep by someone else. And they were given it simply because they're such ordinary people that no one would ever suspect they had it. Whatever it may be.
Have you asked Mrs. Sproat to think about why Betty was taken?
Yes, but all she cares about is having Betty back. That, and having hysterics because she shot someone.
Funny creatures, women, commented Tommy. I wouldn't have risked firing when she did.
She wouldn't have either if she'd known more about it. It was her complete ignorance of the difficulty of the shot that made her do it. But you know, the first time I saw Wanda Polonska, her face seemed vaguely familiar. I wish I could remember who she reminded me of. At Sans-Souci, Tuppence went straight upstairs to her room, where a tall figure turned away from the window. "Sheila?" said Tuppence. The girl's face was completely white. "They've arrested Carl. What shall I do?" "Oh, my dear, they've taken him away. I'll never see him again. What shall I do? What shall I do?" And falling on her knees, she started to cry. Tuppence stroked Sheila's dark head. "Perhaps they are only going to intern him." "That's not what they said. They're searching his room now." Tuppence said slowly, "Well, if they find nothing—" "What might they find?" "I don't know. I thought perhaps you might have an idea." "Me?" Her amazement was real. Any suspicions Tuppence had had that Sheila Perenna was involved in spying died. She continued, "If he is innocent—" "What does it matter?" Sheila interrupted her. "The police will make up a false case against him and say he was working for the Germans." Tuppence said sharply, "My dear child, that isn't true." "The English police will do anything. My mother says so. They'll take him away and lock him up, and one morning they'll stand him against a wall and shoot him." The fisherman on the end of the pier said to Mr. Meadows,
"There's no doubt whatever, I'm afraid,"
Mr. Grant said.
"Among his papers was a list of people where he worked who should be approached as possible fascist sympathizers.
There was also a very clever idea to mix chemicals into fertilizers, which would have destroyed food crops. He also had a supply of invisible ink."
"I've only seen the method once before, and then it was buttons which had been soaked in the stuff. When the fellow wanted to use it, he soaked a button in water. Carl von Dynam's invisible ink wasn't in his buttons, it was in his shoelaces."
As soon as Tommy reported this conversation to Tuppence, she cried, "Tommy, that explains it."
"What?"
"Betty, don't you remember what I told you she did in my room, taking out my shoelaces and soaking them in water? She must have seen Carl do it. He couldn't risk her talking about it, and so he arranged with that woman for her to be kidnapped. Isn't it nice when things begin to make sense? Now we can move forward."
"We need to."
Tuppence nodded. The news from France was very bad indeed. The British Expeditionary Force was being pushed back by the Germans, and now the talk of an invasion of Britain had a frightening reality. Tommy said,
"I think that Carl von Dynam was only a link in the chain, not N or M, who are probably the most important German agents in England." "So, is Mrs. Perenna M? And do you really think her daughter isn't involved in this, Tuppence?"
"I'm quite sure of it."
"First, the man she loves is proved to be a spy, And if her mother is also one, she's not going to have much left, is she? And supposing we're wrong, that M or N is someone else. I've got some other ideas, you know.
Which are?
I think I'll keep them to myself for a bit. We'll see which of us is right.
Well, I think we've got to find out where Mrs. Perenna goes, who she meets, everything. You'd better tell our old friend Albert to follow her this afternoon. He'll be glad to have something to do at last.
You can do that. I'm busy.
Why? What are you doing?
Tommy said, I'm playing golf.
Chapter 9.
It seems quite like old times, doesn't it, madam?
Said Albert. He smiled happily. Tuppence asked about his wife.
Oh, she's all right. Just doesn't like being away from London and me, she says.
I'm not sure we should involve you in this adventure, Albert, worried Tuppence.
Nonsense, madam. I tried to join the army, but they said wait for people your age to be called up. And me, perfectly fit and only too eager to get at those Germans. Fifth column, that's what we're up against, so the newspapers say. And I'm ready to assist you and Captain Beresford in any way you need me to.
Good. Now I'll tell you what we want you to do. After their game of golf, Tommy went to have supper with Commander Haydock at Smuggler's Rest. A tall, middle-aged manservant served them with the skill of a restaurant waiter. When the man had left the room, Tommy complimented the commander on him.
Yes, I was lucky to get Appledore.
How did you get him?
He answered an advertisement. He had excellent references, was far better than any of the others who applied for the job, and asked for very low wages, so of course I hired him immediately.
Tommy laughed.
The war has certainly robbed us of much of our good restaurant service. Most good waiters were foreigners. It doesn't seem to come naturally to Englishmen. Acting like a servant doesn't come easily to the English bulldog, said the commander,
and went on to say that there would be a successful German invasion in the near future.
There's no organisation here, no proper coordination.
Appledore brought whiskey while the commander was talking.
And there are spies everywhere. It was the same in the last war. Foreign hairdressers, waiters.
Tommy thought, waiters? Appledore speaks perfect English, but many Germans do.
All these forms to fill in with idiotic questions, continued the commander.
Tommy spoke on an impulse. The words fitted perfectly with what the commander was just saying.
I know, such as, what is your name? Answer N or M.
There was a crash as Appledore dropped a glass. Tommy's hand was soaked in whiskey.
The man stammered, Sorry, sir.
Haydock was very angry and shouted at Appledore.
You clumsy fool! What do you think you're doing?
Haydock continued for some minutes with more angry words. Tommy was embarrassed for Appledore, but suddenly the commander's anger passed.
Come along and wash that whiskey off, Meadows.
Tommy was soon in the luxurious bathroom. He washed his hands, then turned from the wash basin to dry them. He didn't notice that a bar of soap had dropped onto the floor. His foot stepped on it, and a moment later he skidded across the floor, arms outstretched. One hand came up against the right-hand tap of the bath. The other pushed heavily against the side of a small bathroom cabinet, and his foot hit the end panel of the bath. Immediately, the bath slid out from the wall, and Tommy found himself looking into a cupboard that contained a wireless transmitter. The commander appeared in the doorway, and several things fell into place in Tommy's brain. Had he been blind? That cheerful red face was a mask. It was really the face of an arrogant Prussian officer. He remembered from long ago seeing a Prussian bully shouting at a soldier just as Commander Haydock had shouted at Appledore. And it all fitted in. The enemy agent Hahn had been sent first in order to prepare Smuggler's Rest. He then drew attention to himself, allowing Commander Haydock to unmask him. How natural that Haydock should buy the place and then tell the story to everyone he met. And so, N, securely settled in his place with his secret transmitter and his helpers at Sans Souci, was ready to carry out Germany's plan. Tommy knew that he was in deadly danger unless he could act the part of the stupid Englishman well enough. He turned to Haydock with a laugh.
By Jove, was this another of Hahn's little gadgets? You didn't show me this the other day.
Haydock stood as though made of stone for a minute. Then he relaxed.
Damn funny, Meadows. You went skating over the floor like a ballet dancer.
With an arm round Tommy's shoulders, Haydock took him into the sitting room. Half an hour later, Mr. Meadows stood up.
I really must be going now. It's getting quite late.
Still talking, Mr. Meadows walked towards the door. He was in the hall. He opened the front door. They were going to let him get away with it. The two men stood talking, arranging another golf match for Saturday. Tommy thought angrily, "There'll be no next Saturday for you, Haydock, or whatever your real name is." Voices came from the road. Two men returning from a walk. Men Tommy and the commander knew who played at the golf club. Tommy called to them. They stopped for a few words with Haydock. Then Tommy walked off with them. He had managed to escape. It was so lucky that these men had come along. Tommy said goodbye to them at the gate of Sans Souci and walked up the drive, whistling softly. He had just turned the dark corner by some large bushes when something heavy came down on his head, and he fell into blackness. At breakfast the next morning, Tuppence was aware of a tension in the atmosphere before Mrs. Perenna left the room. Major Bletchley gave a deep laugh.
Mrs. Perenna is in a very bad mood, he remarked. Meadows has been out all night. Hasn't come home yet.
What? Exclaimed Tuppence.
Oh dear,
said Miss Minton, her face reddening. Mrs. Cayley looked shocked. Mrs. O'Rourke merely grinned.
Ah, well, boys will be boys.
Tuppence tried to reassure herself. She and Tommy had agreed that neither should be worried if the other was absent for no apparent reason. She was sure that he would communicate with her, or just arrive very soon. In the evening, Mrs. Perenna reluctantly agreed to ring up the police. A sergeant arrived, and certain facts were noted. Mr. Meadows had left Commander Haydock's house at 10:30. From there he had walked with Mr. Walters and Dr. Curtis to the gate of Sans Souci. From that moment, Mr. Meadows had disappeared. Tuppence knew that Mrs. Perenna had, according to Mrs. Sproat, been out last night, and she believed her to be the most likely suspect in Tommy's disappearance. But Sheila and Major Bletchley had been at the cinema, though separately, and the way that he had insisted on describing the whole film might suggest to a suspicious mind that he was establishing an alibi. And Mr. Cayley had gone for a walk round the garden and had been out for some time. It was very unlike him to risk being out in the cool night air. So, was he really as ill as he claimed? Many miles away, at a secret intelligence location, Tuppence Beresford's daughter was sitting at her desk, frowning.
"What's the matter, Deborah? You're looking worried."
Deborah Beresford looked up at Tony Marsden. He was one of the most brilliant beginners in the coding department. "It's my mother. I'm a bit worried about her. She was annoyed because nobody seemed to want her in this war, so she went down to Cornwall to stay with an aunt. But I told Charles, my boyfriend, who was going down to see his parents who live in Cornwall, to go and visit her, and he did, and she wasn't there."
"Wasn't there?"
"No, and she hadn't been there, not at all."
Your father?"
"Oh, he's in Scotland somewhere."
Maybe your mother's gone to join him."
"She can't. He's in one of those secret areas where wives can't go."
"Oh, well, I suppose she's just gone away somewhere."
"But why? It's so strange. She's been sending me letters, talking about her aunt and her garden and everything."
I know, said Tony hastily. "Of course she'd want you to think. Nowadays, well, people do go away now and again, if you know what I mean."
"No, if you think Mother's just gone away with someone, you're wrong. Mother and Father are devoted to each other, really devoted. But the odd thing is that the other day someone said they'd seen Mother in Leahampton. I said it couldn't be her because she was in Cornwall. But now I wonder."
"Leahampton?"
"Yes, it's the last place Mother would go to. There's nothing to do there, and only old colonels and unmarried ladies live there."
"Doesn't sound a likely place," said Tony.
He lit a cigarette and asked casually,
"What did your mother do in the last war?"
"She was a nurse."
"I thought perhaps she'd been like you, in British intelligence."
"Oh, Mother would never have been able to do this sort of work, although she and Father did get involved in searching for secret papers and spies at one point. Of course, they exaggerate it and make it all sound as though it had been very important." On the following day, Deborah returned to her rooms and was puzzled by something unfamiliar in the appearance of her bedroom. It took her a few minutes to discover what it was. Then she rang the bell and asked her landlady what had happened to the big photograph that stood on the chest of drawers. Mrs. Rowley said she hadn't touched it. Maybe it had been Gladys, the maid. But Gladys also denied having removed it. A man who'd come about the gas had been in Deborah's room, she said, but Deborah refused to believe that an employee of the gas company would have stolen the photograph. It was more likely, in Deborah's opinion, that Gladys had accidentally broken the photograph frame and had hidden it in the rubbish bin. Deborah didn't worry about it. She'd get her mother to send her another photo of herself. Chapter 10. It was Tuppence's turn to talk to the fisherman on the end of the pier. She had hoped that Mr. Grant might have had some comfort for her, but no news of any kind had come from Tommy. Trying her best to make her voice assured and businesslike, Tuppence said, "I continue, of course."
"Of course. There will be time for tears after the battle. We're in the middle of the battle now, and time is short. One piece of information you brought us has been proved correct. You overheard a reference to the 4th when you listened to that telephone conversation in the hall at Sans-Souci. The 4th referred to is the 4th of next month. It's the date fixed for the big attack on this country."
"You're sure?"
"Yes, the 4th is the day."
"But if you know that—"
"We know the day. We know, or think we know, where. We're as ready as we can be. But it's the 5th column here we want to know about. A dozen men in high places, in command of troops in vital areas, can issue conflicting orders and throw the country into a state of confusion. This is necessary for the German plan to succeed. We've got to have inside information in time. We have received information that Mrs. Perenna is a member of the IRA with anti-British sympathies, but we can't get proof. So keep going, Mrs. Beresford. Go on, and do your best."
"The 4th," said Tuppence. "That's barely a week ahead."
"It's a week exactly."
She frowned and began planning a new form of attack. "You see, Albert, it's a possibility," Tuppence said a few hours later.
"I see what you mean, madam, of course, but I don't like the idea very much, I must say."
"I think it might work."
"Yes, madam, but it's exposing yourself to attack. That's what I don't like. And I'm sure Mr. Beresford wouldn't like it either."
"Albert, we've done what we could, staying hidden. It seems to me that now the only chance is to come out into